Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in, well, now. All right, so thanks to all of you for coming to this webinar, which is supporting incorporation of climate change into federal plan revisions for Northern California. My name is Laura Hilberg, and I'm a lead scientist at EcoAdapt. For those of you who aren't already familiar with us, we're a nonprofit organization based in Washington State. We're dedicated to helping resource managers and conservation planners adapt to the impacts of climate change. So specifically, we provide support, training, and assistance to make planning and management less vulnerable and informed. So before we get started, I want to just take a moment to point out the main features of GoToWebinar. So hopefully your screen looks something like this. On the right side of your screen, you'll see your microphone and speaker settings, so you can adjust where your sound is coming from with the drop-down menus here. This button will let you go into full screen mode. You'll see that we have a spot for you to ask questions. You can enter these anytime during the presentation, and we'll answer them afterwards during the Q&A. And then during the time for Q&A at the end, feel free to raise your hand if you'd rather ask questions that way, and we'll unmute you so you can speak directly to the presenters and ask your question. I also want to mention now, and I'll mention this again at the end, but we are recording this webinar, so it'll be available afterwards if you want to watch it or pass it on to other folks who aren't able to be here. And the slides will also be available and posted on our website, and I'll show you where those are going to be. So this webinar is primarily intended to provide folks with some information about the findings and products that came out of the Northern California Climate Adaptation Project. And that represented a 5-year collaborative effort between EcoAdapt, the Forest Service, and BLM. So for this project, the audience was primarily land and resource managers. And the study area of the project was sort of the northwestern California region, which encompassed the 6 rivers, Shasta-Trinity, Mendocino, and Klamath National Forests, as well as the BLM lands within the study area here in this map. So the first goal of this project was to improve understanding of how and why important Northern California resources might be vulnerable to changing climate conditions. And those resources included habitats and species groups with high management or cultural value. Ecosystem services were also discussed within these assessments. And then the second goal was to identify adaptation actions that can be implemented to reduce vulnerabilities and or increase resilience of these important resources. So the outcomes of this project included a synthesis of observed and measured climatic changes, vulnerability assessments for focal habitats and species, a suite of stakeholder-developed adaptation strategies and actions, supporting maps and climate data, which were posted on Adaptation, and then a network of practitioners that are interested in and engaged in adaptation. And that included our Forest Service and BLM partners, as well as other conservation professionals in the region. So before we move forward into the other presentations, I want to quickly orient you to what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to spend a lot of the time together talking more about this project, so what it was, what we learned, and what came out of it that's available for you all to use in your own work. But before I do that, some of our partners from the Forest Service and BLM are going to share context from a federal agency perspective, both in terms of climate change policy, but also how these products are being incorporated into some of the plan revisions that are underway. So first up, Jim Wigand is going to talk about some of the context for considering climate change from a BLM perspective. So Jim, you're going to be up. If you want to unmute yourself and turn on your camera, and I will pass sharing to you. Oh, yeah, I'm going to pass sharing to Katie.
Great, so I think you should be able to see the BLM slide deck now. Please let me know if that's up for everyone.
So Jim.
Great,
Yep.
Thank you everyone. I'm Jim Wigand. I'm an ecologist at the California State Office at BLM. And I had a wonderful opportunity several years ago to initiate this joint effort with Sarah Sawyer for doing a joint agency Northern California climate adaptation effort with EcoAdapt. And you know, we've talked about this being a vulnerability assessment, but I think this vulnerability assessment has led to our ability to really create strengths for both agencies. And it's those strengths that I'd like to be talking about today, just very briefly. I think that one of there's been a suite, a portfolio of climate adaptation products created by this effort. And I think the most important is establishing a process for systematically being able to assess resources of concern to the very people who are stewards of these affected ecosystems, and that the assessment has been conducted not by people far away, you know, in government, but actually people who are on the ground, along with local experts that we incorporated into this process. And so I feel a great sense of ownership that this is a process and products that are from the very people who will be using them in the future. And so here I just give sort of quantitative tallies of the products. And again, it's this multifaceted approach that I think is setting us in really good stead for the future to adapt information about climate and climate change into our planning processes. So next slide, please. So the vulnerability assessment is in a context. And as the BLM in particular is attempting to develop its or enunciate its goals for a concerted climate change response through land and resource management, the vulnerability assessment that we've undertaken with EcoAdapt actually really hones in on two main goals, that is maintaining the productivity of ecosystem services from key ecosystems that we value highly, and then also our overarching concern for protecting both the biological and cultural diversity of things that are being threatened, species and Native American culture, rural culture that are being threatened by climate change. And again, it's in this context now that has somewhat changed since we initially started. We're much more aware now of issues of environmental justice and equity. And we also have in both of our departments climate action plans that also provide a focus and direction for planning. Next. And so with these frameworks, with the vulnerability assessment that EcoAdapt, the BLM and the Forest Service have worked on, other frameworks like the Forest Service's Climate Change Performance Scorecard and the Department of Interior's decision-making framework called RAD, that is resist, accept, direct, you know, decision-making in an uncertain world where climate is changing. And this new focus on having efficient nature-based solutions to address climate change using our understanding of natural processes, and then our social awareness, our social development, so that we're creating new and evolving partnerships to address these increasingly complex management issues dealing with climate change. Next slide. One of the things, again, I think that with the vulnerability assessment, we have that as a pillar. and it is in place with other pillars that exist that have come into development since we began our vulnerability assessment process. And one of the ones that I would highlight of being high value, and perhaps the Forest Service people know this very well, but I'm introducing it particularly for our BLM colleagues, is the great work undertaken by the Forest Service's Office of Sustainability and Climate, and their tools and data that are immediately available to all agencies and to the public. I would just cite as one important example the modeling that the Forest Service has made available so that we can have some idea of the projection of changes in stream temperatures in Northern California. This information and much, much more is all available at the Office of Sustainability and Climate's website. And I urge everyone to make maximum use of this resource as another pillar. Next slide. And then with regard to nature-based solutions and a shared compelling interest in the very same ecosystems that we've been involved in here in Northern California, the state of California just 10 days ago published its nature-based climate solutions for natural and working lands, again, focusing on what the state of California will be doing to address climate change and focusing on forests, shrublands, wetlands, coastal dunes, and focusing also on the very same things that we federal agencies also need to be working on, protecting biodiversity under climate change, carbon storage, making sure that in a time of climate change, that ecosystems are able to reconfigure as species move through the landscape. And I think preeminent is the avoidance of catastrophic fire. Again, another pillar that we can rely on. Next slide. And then the California Energy Commission has taken the lead with the 4th California Climate Change Assessment that was produced in 2018, and a next version will be available in 2023. And it has divided the state into regions, 2 of which overlap with our area of interest. And these are touchstones for us. Have we looked at everything? Are we looking at different points of view? And these reports are also, a way of checking in. Are we covering our ecosystems, thinking about the future in the way that other people in California are? Next slide. And then especially our federal efforts that are renewing now, the U.S. Global Change Research Program for Climate and the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit from NOAA. These are all really great tools that will provide us not only the data, but also ways to analyze the impacts of climate that we can apply to our planning processes as a way to deal with cumulative effects in a highly uncertain future. Next slide. And lastly, I would just like to say that we need to be thinking about our decision space. There are things that we don't have really easy control over. The so-called externalities. We know that we have a lot of scientific uncertainty. We know that our institutions have distinct missions and ways of doing business. And we also understand that social values, evolve, but probably evolve slowly. These 3 items that you see here on the right, those are the things that change slowly. But what we can do in a real personal and I would say in a collaborative, cooperative team sense internally to our agencies, we can expand our awareness and knowledge, our mental model, if you will, by making sure that we devote care and time to understand the diversity of worldviews that people bring to a planning process, understand that we live in a multicultural world where people have different traditions, different understanding, and also that we dedicate time continually with each other individually, however, to understand and improve our understanding of the ecosystems of which we are the stewards. And it's really, unleashing our imaginations and working as teams in creative ways that we can actually expand our decision space, that is, our ability to find solutions to what seem admittedly formidable, sometimes intractable problems. And yet we owe it to ourselves, to make this progress under these difficult conditions. And so I just urge you to be as creative as you can in our planning process, again, within the external constraints of our social and environmental institutional context. Next slide. And lastly, the whole consideration of decision space is to help us to think as broadly as we can. And I just want to encourage us all to think about accomplishing work at scales larger than what we're accustomed to, that we really need to be thinking of what we do, not just as a single agency, but that we develop a social understanding that embraces more people and more landscapes. That oftentimes, and this is particularly often the case with the BLM, we have fragmented land ownership. And sometimes we think, well, what can we do with just fragmented lands? Well, I would just suggest that we look at these as opportunities to leverage partnerships where we know that in order to be effective, we have to work with our neighbors, and that if we're going to accomplish good things, we cannot do it alone, and that we incorporate into our planning process ways to promote partnerships and inspire people in our communities to join with us to deal with climate change response management. And finally, this is today's meeting here. It's just perhaps an hour or more, slightly more, but it's also an opportunity where we can be considering, again, thinking larger than we normally do. Where can the Forest Service and the BLM work jointly for climate change response through its planning efforts in Northern California? Where can we find new opportunities? And I just show here a map of our Lost Coast area, about 40 miles of coast, including state of California lands, where the challenge of thinking about climate broadly really compels us to think about how to manage this landscape in a way that we've never envisioned before, as vulnerable to ocean influences of climate change, but also incredibly important as a landscape of great national meaning to the people of the United States. And I think that the Forest Service lands, their alpine lands in the coast ranges of Northern California, is a similar vulnerable landscape. And how will we be able to look at these landscapes and manage them in new creative ways that envision an entirely new way of management? So with that, I just want to thank you all for, and especially to Laura for setting up this opportunity today to meet with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Katie, I think that, yep, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm just going to turn my camera on, give a quick intro. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Flayhive. I'm a planning and environmental specialist with BLM's California State Office here in Sacramento. So I just have a few slides to talk through today. I just kind of want to give a quick overview of BLM's land use planning processes, including the Northwest California Integrated Resource Management Plan revision that we've been working on, just to kind of frame BLM's perspective of the vulnerability assessment, all the great tools, and kind of talk about where we go from here. You know, we recognize it's an evolving process. We don't have anything prescriptive at this point. You know, we do anticipate further guidance coming out from the department, from BLM at the headquarters, Washington office level, but we really don't have that set of kind of standardized expectations yet. So I just want to highlight a few kind of key points and opportunities that I see within the planning and NEPA processes where this information can really be best used to inform our BLM decision making. So just to kind of give a high level overview of BLM land use planning, what we're talking about is providing for BLM management actions and land use decisions that best meet the principles of multiple use and sustained yield under FLTMA. So that's not to say we manage for every use in every area, or we necessarily maximize potential yield at every point, but the process is really meant to inform our resource management decisions and to respond to issues and consider the trade-offs among the environmental, kind of social and economic values for the whole range of stakeholders across the planning area. So we do that through identifying goals, objectives, administrative designations, allocations for allowable resource use, and management direction. So really, we're trying to address the relationships, the interactions between resources, using the best available science, recognizing the capacity and the connectedness of systems, and ultimately what we're doing is articulating clear goals within the planning area. So just to highlight, you know, a few administration and departmental priorities that are really relevant to what we're talking about today in terms of climate adaptation and also in terms of land use planning. Executive Order 1408, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. As Jim mentioned before, we have under that executive order, the Department of Interior put together a climate action plan, and so it's a really high-level framework for, you know, how we can start thinking about implementing climate adaptation actions through DOI activities. So it has 5 general overarching kind of actions for how we can start thinking about that. Just read them so that we have that in kind of the back of our mind as we're going through the tools today. So action 1 is promoting climate resilient lands, waters, and cultural resources. Number 2 is advancing climate equity. Number 3, transition to a resilient clean energy economy. 4, support tribal and insular community resilience. And action 5 is empowering the next generation of conservation and resilience workers. So just really want to emphasize that the document, you know, discusses a lot about identifying risks and addressing the key vulnerabilities. So I think we're really well positioned to take use of all of the great work that's gone into these EcoAdapt tools and products that we have now. I also just want to highlight a few departmental priorities that I think are really relevant here and important to kind of keep in the back of our mind as we're talking about this. Conserving 30% of lands and waters by 2030, you know, preserving biodiversity, working for special status species recovery, and really ensuring that ecological resiliency. And then as well, I want to mention strengthening government-to-government relationships with tribes and centering equity and environmental justice. So really emphasizing these participatory approaches and kind of stakeholder coordination and really lifting up equity and environmental justice as really important values to be working towards here. I think there's just this overall emphasis on merging kind of the ecological and socioeconomic stability, and I think climate adaptation is a really important nexus where we have a lot of opportunity to do that. And so planning really, I would just say, is a great opportunity for helping us consider the values and the science and the social considerations in BLM's land use decisions. So I just want to go over a little bit about the Northwest California Integrated RMP. So we at BLM are working to revise the existing Arcata Field Office Resource Management Plan and Reading Field Office Resource Management Plan to really address the scientific developments, changing resource conditions, changing social trends, and federal policy. Just really working to kind of update our framework for resource management in these 2 field office areas. It's a very large planning area. It's 2 of our field offices, as I mentioned. So across 8 counties, nearly 400,000 acres of public lands and 300,000 acres of subsurface minerals as well. So the preliminary planning issues that we've identified through pre-scoping and early stakeholder coordination are Really, I'll just read through them quickly. Wildfires, special status species recovery, wilderness management, land tenure patterns and access, recreation, and increasing population and changing land use patterns. We've also highlighted climate change, including sea level rise, ecosystem resiliency as a planning issue. But I really want to recognize here that it's not a separate issue. It really crosses in various ways through all of the planning issues. And so, we really want to make sure that we have an informed analysis of all of our issues at hand. And so I think, this focus that we have today on climate adaptation is really crossing boundaries and crossing issues. Just want to mention as well, we did publish the notice of intent last Friday to prepare the RMP revisions and associated EIS. So Carrie, if you could share the e-planning link in the chat, just want to make sure everyone can get involved in the planning effort more broadly. So we are currently in our 60-day scoping period that extends through June 28th. And we are going to be having public meetings in June. So I just encourage anyone who's interested and available to get involved in the planning process as they can. So I just want to also share some thoughts today about the nexus of planning and climate adaptation. I will mention as well, there's a lot of opportunities for climate mitigation as well, but for the focus of today's presentation, just talking about the adaptation opportunities. And planning here, I should mention, is really mean resource management planning, land use planning, as we work in BLM. So three kind of high level connections that I just mentioned are that planning is a really landscape level long-term opportunity. It's participatory collaboration. It crosses boundaries, it crosses scales, as Jim was mentioning before. And I think it's really a consideration of big picture trade-offs and opportunities. I think climate adaptation requires these large, big picture discussions of what our goals are, what our aims are, and also the discussions of how we can get there and what the opportunities are kind of within our spaces. Particularly as federal agencies. And then I think just like thinking through the planning process, there are various opportunities to use this information throughout. So I'd say, in terms of scoping, it's a really great opportunity to identify relevant issues and management scenarios, as well as stakeholder coordination. I think, for me, scoping is really a good opportunity to consider like what values are important in this area and what adaptation strategy, what does that mean for the world of adaptation strategies? I think, we've highlighted a lot of really great adaptation strategies and opportunities within the vulnerability assessment. And so really we need to understand how we can start including and prioritizing these in BLM resource management planning. And then I think in terms of alternatives, I just mentioned, it's a really good opportunity for us to evaluate opportunities of different management scenarios and kind of identify the range of adaptation strategies. Really start thinking about what is in the BLM decision space and what opportunities do we have as an agency. And then I think in terms of analysis, understanding the big picture impacts and trade-offs, we have a lot of information pulled together to really develop a robust analysis, including a lot of these climate adaptation goals with the tools that we have. And so lastly, I'll just mention decision making, really coming up with a management framework for BLM administered lands that includes prioritization of adaptation strategies and opportunities moving forward. I also just want to mention NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, as a great opportunity moving forward for climate adaptation. I don't want to imply at all that planning is the only opportunity here for us as an agency. I think, it's not that when the RMP, the decision is signed, that is going to be the last opportunity we have. NEPA is a really great opportunity moving forward for that ongoing kind of site-specific resource analysis and decision-making for BLM. So I won't go through this all today just for the purpose of time, but I do just want to make sure that people are thinking about NEPA as a great opportunity to start thinking about this. It's also participatory, and as compared to planning, it is often a lot more site-specific resource analysis. So it kind of helps us take these big picture goals and identify like what adaptation strategies are best suited to specific project locations. And then, in terms of decision making, we can really start implementing the appropriate strategies in specific locations. And so I just really want to emphasize 3 takeaways. The first is that climate vulnerabilities, as Jim mentioned, are really adaptation opportunities. So we have a great opportunity here to build ecological and social resiliency. And I think we're really well positioned here at BLM to, with the planning process just starting, to really take advantage of all of the work that's been done over the last few years, and the products that we have at our disposal are going to be really helpful to inform the plan. And also just really emphasize that planning and NEPA processes are participatory opportunities to inform BLM's land management decisions. Really encourage anyone who's interested to get involved in the planning process specifically, and then as well NEPA processes moving forward, to ensure that we are really having the most thorough, the most robust analysis and considerations that we can. And lastly, I just mentioned, the vulnerability assessment and the products that Laura's going to be going over today are going to be really key in informing our Northwest California Integrated Resource Management Plan, then moving forward from NEPA documents. So I'd encourage everyone to keep reviewing and keep referencing the documents, and don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Katie. All right, so next, Laura and Logan from the US Forest Service are going to be talking a little bit about that context.
Perfect, thanks so much, Laura, and great presentation, Jim and Katie. Happy to be here. My name is Logan Graham, currently acting as Sustainable Operations and Climate Change Coordinator for the U.S. Forest Service Region 5. Region 5 is all of California, Hawaii, and the U.S. affiliate of Pacific Islands. And I'm joined here by Laura Bullock, and I'll give Laura a chance to introduce herself really quickly.
Hi all, really appreciate the opportunity to join you today. I'm Laura Bullock. I am the Region 5 Ecosystem Services and Climate Change Program Lead, and I've had the opportunity to watch this play out over the past few years. It's really exciting to be here to see it roll out today. Back to you, Logan.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, as Laura's mentioned, we're really excited to see this product going forward. Laura, can you jump to the next slide for me? Thanks, guys. I just want to give a little overview of where the Forest Service is guiding on climate change, where we see climate change coming from. I know Katie mentioned this a little bit, so I'll try to keep it pretty brief here. But obviously a lot of our current work in the Forest Service world and climate change has been driven by Executive Order 14008, which was released by President Biden in January of 2021 when he came into office, which looks at tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. Of course, as Katie mentioned, there's a couple of key points in that executive order. The first is that America Beautiful 30 by 30, working to kind of conserve 30% of our lands by 2030, which obviously impacts a lot of our Forest Service land as well as our BLM land. More specific to the Department of Agriculture, also has laid out the Climate Smart Ag and Forestry Plan that really calls on the USDA to work with agricultural and timber producers to incorporate climate smart practices into their operations. Among other things, it is a $1 billion investment to support America's climate smart farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners to try to think critically about how we can be more climate smart in all our agriculture production and timber production. So that's a great initiative that's moving forward, that's obviously impacting our Forest Service land, especially with our timber producers. In many ways, we're excited about that. And probably most importantly for the Forest Service and for the USDA, is our USDA Climate Action Plan that was released in August of 2021. Really great document that kind of lays out the roadmap of how the Department of Agriculture and the Forest Service is approaching climate change, how we're both adapting to it, resisting it, and kind of understanding how it's going to impact our agriculture producers and our forested lands. Specifically to the Forest Service, that Climate Action Plan directed us to develop our own Climate Action Plan. So that's in development right now. It'll be kind of a guiding document for the Forest Service and how we're going to approach climate change moving forward. Both Laura and myself had a chance to look at it. It's a really exciting document. We're hoping that it should be released here around June or so. Don't hold me to it, but June is kind of the goal to release that document to the public. Should be really an important document for our agency moving forward as we start to think about how we can incorporate climate change and adaptation and resilience into all of our forestry planning, all of our projects, and all of our efforts. Along with that Climate Action Plan is our Climate Action Tracker, which we're calling the CAT. Some of you might know both the Climate Scorecard 1.0 and 2.0. So this is kind of the new iteration of that, is essentially kind of the reporting arm of our climate action plan. So allow us to track how different forest leaders are doing in response to climate change, seeing where we're making good efforts in responding to climate change, where are areas that we're lacking, where we can divert more resources. So that should be released in June as well, along with the climate action plan. The goal is to have that first kind of round of reporting from the forest due about December of this year, December 2022. That'll be really an important document to go hand in hand with that climate action plan to help us make sure we are tracking how we are responding to climate change. So that's kind of the current outlook on climate change in the Forest Service, guided by that executive order. And of course, I wanted to mention too, the executive order that was passed just 2 weeks ago on Earth Day by Biden, the Executive Order 14057, which is looking at strengthening Americans' forests, boosting wildfire resilience, and combating global deforestation. There's also some great stuff in there on climate change as it relates to the Forest Service, looking at trying to reduce some of these mega wildfires that have been driven in part by climate change. So that's also a great guiding document that was just released, and I encourage folks to check out that executive order as well when they get a chance. Hit to the next slide, Laura. Then looking a little more closely at Region 5 again, which is California, Hawaii, US affiliated Pacific Islands, or 18 national forests in California. Climate change work is kind of led by the climate change integration team. That's really led by Laura and myself, and it's working to kind of represent our approach in the region to climate change and ensuring that climate change incorporations and considerations are incorporated into our work on our forest work and forest projects. So a lot of that work is driven by unit climate change coordinators. There are forestry officials on each of our forests who will kind of have time set aside to think about climate change, working to incorporate climate change considerations into different projects on the forest there. It's really just kind of a key team and a key program on a region to kind of think through climate change. So I would encourage folks to check out that team. It's really the large facilitation role, kind of working with the Washington Office on Stability and Climate, working with the region leaders and working with those on ground, on forest level folks to make sure we are thinking about how climate change is going to impact anything from our recreation trailheads to our larger forestry practices, from working on fire resilience to returning and doing stuff after a fire has come through. So that's kind of the team here on Region 5 that's thinking through climate change as it impacts all of our California national forests. Next slide. And then really briefly here, just want to give an overview of what that climate change integration team is working on here in the region, going from left to right. The first one is really what we're seeing here today, looking at executing, elaborating on our vulnerability assessments. Of course, this was the NorCal, Northern California EcoAdapt vulnerability assessment. We're really excited about that. That's going to help us kind of think through critically, especially how we're going to look at our forest plan revision process and how we think through, okay, once we understand where our vulnerabilities are at, how we can kind of incorporate climate change considerations into our projects. In hand, we're also trying to expand our climate change vulnerability assessments across the entire region. So we currently have an assessment in place for the Sierra Nevada region. We just are finalizing one for Southern California forests as well. So the goal is to kind of have comprehensive idea where climate change assessments and where our vulnerabilities are across the whole region. So we're really excited about the effort we did 2 years ago in the Sierra Nevada, and now bringing that effort to Southern California. And all that will kind of drive our efforts to incorporate those adaptation workbooks and examples into our NEPA planning and our forest planning, and make sure we are considering climate change in all of our projects. Moving down to the bottom row, another priority for the region is kind of looking at sustainable operations approach. So that's kind of leading our efforts to put electric vehicle chargers across our Forest Service locations, also solar panels, kind of greening up our operations there. So that's another arm of what we're focused on here in the climate change world. And obviously we already mentioned a little bit on the climate adaptation plan and climate action tracker, but a large role this climate integration team will be kind of working with forests to make sure they understand that plan and the climate action tracker when it comes out, and how we're supposed to approach that and make sure we're following those guiding principles. And then lastly, developing climate change communication plans. A lot of that work is just making sure forests can communicate about climate change to the public, and also trying to connect different researchers and practitioners from for example, the California Climate Hub or UC Davis or different, really just smart, brilliant people in the climate change world trying to make sure their communication and their ideas are getting down to the forest, and we're distributing that to the public as well. So that's the big idea and picture of where our priorities are. But really exciting stuff going on here. Obviously today we're really excited to kind of learn more about this Northern California assessment and think critically about how we can use that assessment in the forest plan revision process, which is what Laura's going to talk about a little bit now.
Very good. Thanks so much, Logan. As Logan mentioned, I'm just going to very quickly highlight for you some connection to the 2012 planning rule. I know there's mixed familiarity with this audience. You know, in terms of assessments, we have a requirement for responsible officials to identify and evaluate information on climate change and other stressors that are relevant to the plan area. In terms of sustainability, we have a requirement for climate change to be taken into account when the responsible official is developing plan components for ecological sustainability. And then just to point out that climate change is viewed as one of many system drivers here, right? So it's not climate change independently, it's the holistic picture. In addition, with respect to multiple use, so when providing for ecosystem services and multiple uses, the responsible official is required to consider climate change. Again, this is a holistic approach. And then with monitoring, we have here that measurable changes to the plan area related to climate change and other stressors affecting the plan area are to be monitored. And just to point out and bring some synergies to what Logan had just shared, there's a symbiotic relationship here with this new climate action tracker, otherwise known as our scorecard 3.0, that's going to be rolling out here very soon, right? This is the monitoring arm of the Forest Service Climate Adaptation Plan. It also fits very nicely in terms of the monitoring components with respect to climate change for the 2012 planning rule. And now I am going to hand the baton to Sarah Sawyer, and she's going to really point out and bridge this some of these planning considerations into the Northwest Forest Plan area. So there's our contact information, but with that, we will hand the baton to Sarah.
Awesome, thanks. Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Sawyer. I'm the National Wildlife Ecologist for the Forest Service, but during this whole project, I was a Regional Wildlife Ecologist for Region 5 of the Forest Service. So, you know, got to be part of the process the whole way through. But I will also acknowledge Ramona Butts, who couldn't be here today, but she is the province ecologist for the northern province of Region 5, and she has been really engaged in this process the whole way through and tying it into plan revision, which is one of the foundational reasons that we embarked on this effort in the first place. Go ahead, next slide. So as Laura Hilbert mentioned initially, the goals of this project were really to look at vulnerabilities in our resources and then identify adaptation actions. And so our idea in like embarking in this partnership was that plan revision is coming around to our Northwest Forest Plan area. So the Northwest Forest Plan is a multi-forest plan that covers 4 of the Region 5 forests. So 4 of our 18 national forests are under this plan. It also covers 14-ish forests in Oregon and Washington, which is Region 6 of the Forest Service. So it's a big area. There's a large national focus on it, and it is up for plan revision. And so as we were thinking through the resources that we would need to be able to revise our plans effectively, this project was a key component of that. And as Jim mentioned, we were able to partner with BLM to develop those resources. So the methods, of course, were looking at the science that's out there, developing some new information, but also really importantly, tapping into all of the experts that exist in this area that have been working on these resources within the Northwest Forest Plan for years to decades to make sure we're bringing that expertise to bear. So the role of this project in planning, it informs multiple phases, and Laura Bullich just spoke about some of those phases and some of those requirements in the 2012 planning rule. But the idea is that this feeds into the sort of best available scientific information, or BASI, that we are working with as our foundation for plan revision. It informs the assessment phase, the plan revision phase, and the monitoring phase. And I'll describe a little bit about what each of those phases are. Next slide. So here we are in the phases of plan revision, and here we're specifically talking about the Northwest Forest Plan, which covers the Mendocino, the Klamath, the Shasta-Trinity, and the 6 Rivers National Forests, plus little bits of a couple of other forests that weren't the major focus here. But you can see there's this pre-assessment phase, and that's the development of a science synthesis. So just gathering all the existing scientific information to make sure we've got the best available scientific information to kick off the planning phase. Then we've got the assessment phase where we're assessing current conditions, we're assessing possible future conditions. And if you are familiar with NEPA language, this is really informing our need to change. What is working well already in our plans that we can just carry forward into the future, and what do we maybe need to add or modify, looking at what's happened over the last couple of decades and looking forward to what we expect to come. Then we move into the plan revision phase, where we're actually developing plan components, working with all of our stakeholders and publics, we're working with partners to develop those plans. And then we'll be monitoring those plans moving forward. And so it's going to inform each of those phases, the products from this project. Go ahead, next slide. So that first phase on here is that pre-assessment phase, which is where we created the science synthesis. And there's a link to the science synthesis in the chat now. My slide is not advancing. Did you advance to the next?
Laura, is the slide advancing working?
I'm getting an error message that it's paused on my end. Is it working now?
Yeah, go for it.
Great.
No.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I thought I removed this part. Go ahead to the next one. Okay, we missed a couple in the middle there. You can go back. Sorry, it must have advanced rapidly. Back a couple. Oh yeah, one more back. Perfect. So just a little more details on those phases that I was talking about. So that pre-assessment phase where the science synthesis was created, and this science synthesis actually does predate the project that we're talking about today. And so it was integrated more as a resource into this project than vice versa. But I want to point folks here because there is a specific chapter on climate change in the Northwest Forest Plan area in the science synthesis. And the authors of many of these chapters were engaged in this vulnerability assessment adaptation project as well. So there's a lot of integration there. Next slide. So then the next phase was the assessment phase, which has two parts. First is the bioregional assessment. So this actually covers all of those Northwest Forest Plan forests in both Region 5 and Region 6. So it's very high level. There's not a specific climate change chapter. Instead, climate change components were integrated across all of the chapters. And so the folks in charge of that, including Ramona Butts, really relied on early drafts of this project and integrated all of that information that was being developed here in our EcoAdapt PLN partnership into the bioregional assessment as well. The second phase of the assessment phase, the second subphase, is going to be the forest level assessment. So each of those 4 Northern California forests that are within the Northwest Forest Plan area will have their own assessments, which are more locally focused. And the products from this project are already being incorporated into those as well. If you can go to the next slide. And you can advance probably twice to the, yeah. So here we are. We're currently still in that assessment phase. We've completed the first sub portion, which is that bioregional assessment, and we're in the second phase, which is those forest level assessments, and they're integrating all of these EcoAdapt products that you're going to hear about in a second into that phase. Just wanted folks to know that we are currently on pause. We're on hold moving forward in the rest of the phases until at least October of this year, and that's because of all the major fires. The same staff that's dealing with all of the fires that happened in 2020 and 2021 are also the same staff who are dealing with plan revision. So we are on pause for now, and October would be the earliest that we would get started again. And all of these products, of course, will then be available as we move forward into all of these coming up. So the last slide here, if you want to advance, is just contact information for Ramona, who is really tying these things together across that zone moving forward, and she can always be contacted, and it's a great resource. That's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah, all of you. That's great. So Laura, if you want to put the screen back to me, I can move into the talking a little bit more about our project. Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. That was great context for sort of what was going on while the project was happening, and how what I'm talking about is going to be used in the Forest Service and the BLM, and hopefully can give some folks ideas about how these pieces fit into the federal agency work. So for the remainder of the webinar, I'm going to talk more about the Northern California Climate Adaptation Project, so the work that we did, as well as our findings and the different products that came out of it. So to give you a sense of the arc of the project as a whole, so the project was a stakeholder-driven process that centered around 4 sets of workshops. And for those workshops, Forest Service and BLM partners came together with other stakeholders, and those included a lot of people here on the webinar I saw, so folks from the state of California, tribal members, people from universities, conservation NGOs. So the first step was to identify natural resources to focus on for the assessment, so which habitat types and species of significant management or cultural interest did we want to consider. In this step, we held an additional workshop that was just focused on getting input from area tribes into culturally valued resources that should be included in the project. So those workshops happened in March of 2016. The second step was to assess vulnerability for each of the selected resources, and I'll describe the findings of that process in a little bit more detail later on. So those happened in May 2017. So following the vulnerability assessment, we convened adaptation planning workshops to identify strategies and actions. Those wrapped up in December 2017. Then COVID happened a little bit later as we were sort of pulling everything together and getting ready for the last set of workshops. And in that last set of workshops, we focused on designing more concrete implementation plans that were intended to lead to on-the-ground action. So those happened in November of 2021. And then the project, the whole project wrapped up in January of this year, 2022, so just a couple of weeks. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the findings of the project and the different products that we have available. So those include vulnerability assessments, a summary of regional climate impacts, some more detailed maps about climatic water deficit, a suite of adaptation strategies and actions, and then a series of adaptation implementation plans. So before we go over vulnerability assessment results for the project, I want to give a quick primer on what we mean when we talk about vulnerability. So the purpose of a vulnerability assessment is to identify which resources are most vulnerable to climate change and why. And so we do that by considering both the potential impact of climate change on a resource as well as its ability to respond to those changes. We evaluate 3 different components of vulnerability. Those are exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. So exposure is the first one. So that's a measure of how much change in climate that a resource might experience. And when we look at exposure, we're primarily looking at the direction and magnitude of observed and projected changes in climate stressors and disturbance regimes. But we also consider the degree of uncertainty associated with projected changes. So how sure are we that these changes are going to happen? The second one is sensitivity, and that's a measure of whether and how a resource will be affected by a given change in climate. So for that, we consider climate drivers like temperature and precipitation, climate-driven changes in disturbance regimes like flooding and wildfire, and also non-climate stressors that might interact with climate change to increase vulnerability, and that's things like invasive pollution or land use conversion. And then the last component of vulnerability is adaptive capacity, and that's a measure of a resource's ability to accommodate or cope with climate change impacts with minimal disruption. So some examples of things we might think about here include how widely a habitat or species is distributed, and if it is isolated or well connected, how well a habitat or species can resist or recover from unfavorable environmental changes and disturbances. Diversity, and that's in terms of landscape heterogeneity, habitat structure, species and functional group diversity or genetic diversity. And then also human dimension. So how much do people value the resource, and how much potential is there to manage the resource to help reduce the impacts of climate change? Whoops, sorry. So this is an example of the kind of information you'll find in the vulnerability assessments. This example I'm going to run through is for late successional dependent species in Northern California. So that was a species group that included Pacific fisher, Humboldt martin, Sierra martin, northern spotted owl, and the terrestrial vulnerabilities for the marbled murrelet. So this group of species was evaluated as having moderate high vulnerability due to moderate exposure to climate changes, moderate high sensitivity to those changes, and low moderate capacity to adapt or respond to those changes. You'll note over here too that the scoring color scheme for adaptive capacity is inverted because low adaptive capacity makes a habitat more vulnerable to climate change. So late successional dependent species are likely to be exposed to a lot of different climate stressors and disturbance regimes. So things like increases in air temperature and heat waves, changes in precipitation amount and timing, increases in drought, decreases in snowpack and earlier timing of snowmelt and runoff, more intense storms, and increases in the wildfire. So exposure to those changes might impact the species group by decreasing survival and recruitment, altering prey availability and interspecific competition for food or habitat resources, causing changes in habitat structure or reducing the availability of critical habitat features, reducing habitat extent and connectivity, causing shifts in species distribution. And then this group is also very sensitive to non-climate stressors, things like fire exclusion, timber harvest, the presence of roads and poisons. In terms of being able to respond to climate change, the adaptive capacity of this species group is enhanced by things like high behavioral plasticity. And then there's also some regulatory and legislative support for species management through things like the Endangered Species Act. And then factors that undermine adaptive capacity are the fact that a lot of regional populations are declining already. Those small isolated populations are vulnerable to extirpation or genetic bottlenecks. And then recovery is limited by low reproductive potential for a lot of these species and their reliance on late seral stand conditions. So this graph shows all of the habitats that we assessed in terms of their overall vulnerability score, but it also shows the individual components of vulnerability that are driving that score. So the habitat names are color coded based on their final vulnerability score. All of the habitats ended up being either moderate, which is light green, or moderate high, which is that yellowish color. So they're placed on the graph according to their adaptive capacity scores and their combined sensitivity and exposure scores, with adaptive capacity on the vertical axis and sensitivity and exposure on the horizontal axis. So this figure is basically useful as a quick look at what is driving vulnerability. Is it high sensitivity and exposure or low adaptive capacity? So important things about this, the most vulnerable habitats came up as coastal dune systems, true for forest and subalpine forests. So for these habitats, they all had moderate and high sensitivity and exposure and low moderate adaptive capacity. So both of those were really driving vulnerability. The least vulnerable systems were coastal redwood forest and mixed conifer ponderosa forest. Those had moderate sensitivity and exposure, but they had moderate high adaptive capacity, and that moderate high score resulted in a lower overall vulnerability score. And this is the same figure, but for the species and species groups that we looked at. So the most vulnerable species and species groups were rare trees, which included knobcone pine, rare cypress, and Pacific yew, Port Orford cedar, native mussels, salamanders, and late successional dependent species. And those all had moderate high sensitivity and exposure and low moderate adaptive capacity. And then migratory shorebirds were the least vulnerable group. Those had moderate sensitivity and exposure, but adaptive capacity score of high. And that adaptive capacity score came from very high, wide geographic distribution of this species group. We're looking at the species group as a whole, so individual species might not have a wide distribution, but looking at the group as a whole, migratory shorebirds are found very, very widely distributed. The birds have very high mobility, high diversity within the species group, again, not necessarily within each individual species. And especially there's very high public value of this species group and very high support for management, particularly for climate change. So all of those things reduced the vulnerability of this species group. So I also wanted to highlight a few of the key trends, so things that showed up across many of the different habitat and species assessments. So the most common climate stressors were precipitation and soil moisture and drought. That's no surprise, given that we're talking about California. And similarly, the disturbance regime that was the sort of thing that came up the most was wildfire. Also disease, often that was introduced diseases. Non-climate stressors that were very common across all of them were fire suppression and exclusion. That included fire exclusion as well. Timber harvest, pollutions and poisons, dams and water diversions, and roads, highways, and trails. Adaptive capacity factors that were common were that a lot of these scored higher because of high physical and topographical diversity. Again, that's not surprising. Northern California is, known for that. A lot of sort of elevational climate gradients there, and also large areas of undeveloped and roadless lands increased connectivity for a lot of these. Things that lowered adaptive capacity for a lot of them are that a lot of habitats and species that we looked at, that we assessed, were already degraded. Past management activities have impacted a lot of these. That was often things like fire exclusion and timber harvest. And for a lot of these, there's a relatively low or low to moderate capacity and ability to manage specifically for climate change. And that's, again, either because of capacity issues like constraints around staffing and time, or ability, like there are just things that you can't really manage for. So for the vulnerability assessments, we created these really often quite long, in-depth vulnerability assessment syntheses for all 33 of the focal resources. Those included expert assessment, downscale climate projections that were used to evaluate exposure, review of the scientific literature, and then all of them underwent a peer review process as well. So the next thing I want to introduce you to is this overview of regional climate impacts that we put together, and that's a report that summarizes the historical trends and future projections for both climate stressors and climate-driven changes in natural disturbance regimes. So that includes a summary table with a quick look at the direction of the trend and 1 or 2 bullets summarizing the future changes, and then longer narrative description of the trends and changes and maps for the variables that we calculated using downscaled data from the basin characterization model. And the downscale climate projections here were done in collaboration with partners at CBI, the Conservation Biology Institute. And this information fed directly into the vulnerability assessments. It was used to do the exposure rankings. So one of the things that we did with this information was we took a more in-depth look at climatic water deficit. Climatic water deficit is a metric that looks at water stress, and it takes into account both water inputs, so precipitation, as well as evapotranspiration for this sort of metric of net water stress or water. So we use information on the historic variability in CWD and projected change in CWD, and we compared these two things to better understand which areas of the landscape might be vulnerable to significant changes. So this map shows portions of the study area that experience the greatest and least historical variability in CWD. And that was calculated using the 80th and 20th percentiles. So these areas represent ecosystems that are likely either very well adapted to change and they already experience a lot of extremes, or ecosystems that are adapted to very stable conditions and that don't experience a lot of year-to-year changes. So then the second map in orange and red is calculated in a similar way with the percentiles, and it shows portions of the study area where are projected to increase by the greatest or the least amount in the future, by the 20th year. So then we put these two maps together to find the places where they intersect. So for instance, where the areas of the greatest historical variability are also expected to experience the greatest amount of change in CWD, those areas are in dark purple here. So each of the combinations are shown here. The least variability are the lighter colors, most variable are the darker colors, and then similarly, least change is the greens, most change is the purples. So the areas where these intersect suggest places on the landscape where changes in CWD are more likely to be impacting vegetation that's either adapted to more stable or more variable conditions. And that gives us an idea of where it might or might not exceed the historical range of variability. So this little graph lays out the different interactions and some potential interpretations of the information. So for example, areas with historically low CWD variability that are expected to undergo significant increases in the future, those areas are in light purple. They might be more likely to experience type conversion or ecosystem collapse in the future, because those increases are happening in areas that are not well adapted to variation and extremes already. By contrast, areas of historically high variability that do experience significant increases in CWD, that's dark purple, they might already support species that are well suited for survival during periods of very dry conditions. So these maps and graphics are in that report, and the GIS layers behind them are also posted on Adaptation. So after focusing on the projected climate impacts and vulnerability assessment, the second part of the project shifted to look at adaptation strategies and actions. So when we're talking about climate change adaptation, we're referring to adjustments in natural or human systems in response to changing climate conditions. And adaptation strategies attempt to reduce climate change vulnerability, either by reducing the impacts of climate change, so that's sensitivity and exposure, or by increasing resilience to climate change, and that sort of corresponds to adaptive capacity. We organize climate change adaptation strategies into 3 general management approaches that are based on the RAD framework that Jim mentioned. So we call this first group resistance resilience, and those are focused on managing for persistence of existing ecosystems. Those strategies, so an example is using exclusion fencing in upland areas to prevent herbivory of oak seedlings. Those strategies are often focused on a near or midterm planning horizon, and they can be quite management intensive. The next approach is acceptance, and that's focused on accommodating change in response to novel conditions. So an example is identifying areas where post-fire type conversion should be allowed to occur without management intervention. Those generally have a long-term planning horizon and don't involve management action beyond just observation and monitoring. The third is direct response. And so those are focused on actively facilitating change or transformation in response to novel conditions. So an example would be experimenting with seeds from climate analog zones for restoration projects. Those generally also are more long-term strategies, but they can be relatively management intensive. And then at EcoAdapt, we also add 2 additional management approaches. These are knowledge and collaboration, and they describe adaptation strategies that support management efforts. They're usually precursors to implementing a strategy that falls under one of these other approaches. So the first one is knowledge. That's focused on gathering information about climate impacts and management effectiveness. Those are usually actions related to research or monitoring. And then collaboration. And that's focused on coordinating management efforts and capacity across organizations. So one of the primary outputs of this project was a suite of adaptation strategies and actions, which were based on stakeholder input, as well as strategies and actions that we found within the scientific literature. Those came from peer-reviewed journal articles, as well as from white papers and publicly available tribal documents, such as the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan. This table has 149 adaptation actions, and they're grouped into 4 major habitat categories: coastal, freshwater, forest woodland, and grassland shrubland. So we created this pretty extensive table that evaluates each of those adaptation actions. And the intent is to help people figure out which of these they might want to prioritize for implementation on a particular site. So we primarily looked at things like how effective a particular action might be at reducing climate change vulnerability, how feasible it would be to implement that strategy at a scale that would reduce vulnerability, and then whether there are co-benefits or conflicts or unintended consequences that might need to be considered. So this table is an Excel spreadsheet. It's available for download. It is locked so that it can't be edited, but it can be sort of filtered and sorted and that kind of thing. So the first sheet gives an overview of the contents of the table and definitions and rankings for each of the criteria that we use to evaluate the actions. The last sheet has references for all the literature sources that were cited in the table. And then the middle sheet is where the table of adaptation strategies and actions is, and it has one action on each row. So you can filter by each of the columns. So for instance, you could go up to the habitat column and click the drop-down arrow to hide everything except the coastal strategies if you wanted to narrow your focus. So we've grouped each of these actions into very broad management goals. And the management goals are based on the adaptation menus created by the Northern Institute for Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, for those of you who are familiar with their work. So examples of the management goals we used are things like reduce the impact of non-climate stressors, reduce the risk and impacts of severe disturbances and extreme events, sustain ecological functions and processes, maintain and protect refugia, allow or facilitate habitat and species adjustments to better align with changing climate conditions. So nested under those management goals are the adaptation strategies, and those are more specific. Those are things like prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive species, restore the role of fire as an ecological process on the landscape, maintain or create migration corridors for native plants and wildlife. And then finally, we have the actions themselves, and those represent the specific implementable tasks that can accomplish whatever it is we're trying to do. So an example of an adaptation action would be here: remove invasive plants from intact remnant dune habitats to allow for the recovery of native vegetation and natural dune processes. So that action is here, and then everything else in the table in that row is referring specifically back to the action, so that particular cell. So for example, we have all of these actions categorized by their adaptation approach that I talked about earlier. This next section links the action to the vulnerabilities that it addresses, and that's both in terms of climate impacts and adaptive capacity factors. And that's meant to help people connect these actions back to specific climate change vulnerabilities in the system that you're working in. So you can think about what the vulnerabilities that you know in that system or you know that you've learned from the vulnerability assessment, and then look for actions that target those vulnerabilities. So this is that same action that I was showing you about removing invasive plants from intact dune habitats. So the first thing that we're evaluating in the table in terms of evaluations is how effective implementing the action would be at reducing climate change vulnerability. And there we're making some assumptions. We're assuming that the action is being successfully implemented and that it's being done at a meaningful or appropriate scale, spatial scale and temporal scale. The rankings we use across this document are low, moderate, high. So when we're talking about effectiveness, so if an effective strategy might reduce climate change vulnerability directly or indirectly by reducing impacts of non-climate stressors that interact with climate change, increasing the general resilience of the resource, so its ability to absorb or recover from rapid changes, and enhancing support or capacity for climate-informed management. And that can be things like research and monitoring, collaborative efforts, policy changes, capacity building, outreach and education. And then for each of these, there's also this notes, this column for notes. And that's where we sort of put additional information, or a big part of doing this was also looking for sources in the literature, particularly around effectiveness, that could provide some evidence that this action actually is effective on the ground after it's been implemented. So the next category is feasibility, and that's asking how feasible it is to implement the action at a scale that would effectively reduce vulnerability. So there are 4 different factors that go into this. So affordability, and that refers to the cost of fully implementing the action, both in terms of initial costs as well as maintenance or other ongoing costs that are necessary to sustain the benefits of the action. Affordability was ranked from low, which is very expensive, to high, which is very affordable. Technical feasibility is the second one, so that refers to capacity, things like time and labor, resources like equipment and specialized skills or technology that would be required to implement the action. Institutional or legal feasibility, that's institutional, legal, or regulatory barriers to implementation. Those might be administrative or regulatory requirements, policy conflicts, or potential legal challenges. And socio-political support, so that's public or political backing for implementation of the action. The next category is talking about co-benefits and potential conflicts or unintended consequences that might be associated with implementing the action. So that might be impacts on non-target habitats, species, or ecosystem services. So in the case of this action, where we're considering the sort of target to be restoring dune habitat, but we would expect it to benefit native species, things like migratory shorebirds and other threatened or endangered plant and wildlife species. It would increase floral resources and diversity for pollinators, but it could, I found this study, it also is known to reduce amphibian populations. They're often found in the drainages that form behind overstabilized dunes, and so that's just something to keep in mind. We also think about impacts on human well-being, and here we're talking about all the ways that implementing adaptation actions influence human communities through things like food security, water supplies and water quality, air quality, flood control, public health and safety, recreational opportunities, jobs and income sources, and other economic opportunities, cultural well-being. That's things like availability of culturally valued species, ability of tribes to maintain traditional practices, tribal sovereignty, as well as things like sense of place and beauty. And then the last thing, we also specifically thought about climate mitigation efforts. So would implementing this action increase or decrease greenhouse gas emissions, or the rate of carbon sequestration and storage in plants and soils? And then finally, the last thing on this spreadsheet is some additional details about where, when, and how the action could be implemented in northwestern California specifically. This information primarily came from our workshop participants, but in some cases we supplemented it with details we found in the literature. And where we did find information from the literature, it's all cited. But anything that isn't cited definitely came from the workshop. Not all of these actions have details, but we added them where we could. So the next product I want to highlight are these vulnerability adaptation summaries. And those are meant to provide a little bit of a a more digestible format than the syntheses and then that big table. And so these are broken down. There's 4 of them, one for each of those major habitat groups. And those include a summary of key habitat and species vulnerabilities and tables that link the adaptation strategies and actions to those same identified vulnerabilities. So the first half of them have sort of the rankings for each of the habitats that are in that habitat group. So the forest and woodlands, I think there's 1, 2, 3, yeah, there's 8 habitats that we looked at that fell within the forest and woodland group. So these are their overall rankings. Oh boy, a summary of vulnerabilities for the habitats and also for the species. And here we emphasized vulnerabilities that were sort of common across the different habitats in that group. And then we also have this figure, and that's a graph that's similar to the ones I showed you earlier, where it gives you a sense of the different components of vulnerability for each of these. And then the second half of the summary introduces the adaptation strategies and actions for the habitats in that group. So there are 2 tables. The first is this higher level summary, and that has the overarching management goals and the adaptation strategies. And then the second table is longer, and it provides adaptation actions under each of the strategies, and it links those actions to the adaptation approach and to the vulnerabilities that they would address. And then the last product that I wanted to highlight today is the workshop proceedings, and those summarize the activities and outcomes from our 4th and final set of workshops, which happened last November. And those workshops focused on developing implementation plans that were designed to support natural resource managers in on-the-ground adaptation projects on high priority sites in northwestern California. So the report includes an overview of climate adaptation planning, a description of the workshop activities, a review of the priority sites selected for implementation planning, and then the actual adaptation implementation plans that were created by our workshop participants. And there are six of those, one for each of 6 sites that are within the study area. So these are the sites that the workshop participants selected. They went through this process where they evaluated value, current ecological condition, and future climatic suitability, and then used based on a set of sort of critical questions that helped them sort of think through each of those 3 categories and assign to these rankings. And they used these rankings to select sites from within, a longer brainstormed list. And identify adaptation approaches that might make sense based on these things. So, a high value site, you might be more likely to go with a resistance approach to maintain that site, even if it's not in great condition. So we conducted 2 identical workshops. One was focused on the Ukiah Arcata area, one on the Redding area, and each of those workshops had 3 breakout groups, and each breakout group generated a list of sites and then selected one to develop an implementation plan for. So these are the 6 implementation, the 6 priority sites that were selected, one by each group. And there are implementation plans within that workshop proceedings for each of these sites. So once the site was selected, the group worked through this implementation plan template. And it included a number of different sections to help them identify the rationale for restoration. So things like desired outcomes and restoration targets, actionable steps. So that's the actual adaptation actions that they want to implement, the responsible parties and roles, resources that would be needed, anticipated costs, adaptive management options. So things like performance metrics and management triggers that would be associated with the different restoration targets. And also funding and communications or outreach requirements. So this is just a screenshot of the first section of the implementation plan for the Plaskett-Keller post-fire restoration site in Mendocino National Forest that one of the groups worked on. And the photo on the right is actually of that site. It was provided by one of our workshop attendees, Chad Roberts. And then I want to add that these adaptation implementation plans they're not intended to be an official plan for that site. They're primarily being used as a teaching tool to demonstrate to folks how to walk through the process of, choosing adaptation actions and thinking through how they would actually be implemented on the ground. But by focusing on real sites and existing or planned or hoped for projects, we're hoping to provide an opportunity for the work that people were doing in the breakout group to actually potentially apply or contribute to work on the ground in Northwestern California. So that concludes the overview of everything that we did and produced in the project. And the last thing I want to do is show you where to find all of these different things. Carrie, if you could put the link to this in the chat box. This is the product page. It's associated with the sort of overall project web page. The URL is here at the bottom of the slide, but Carrie is also going to add it to the chat. So there's the overview of climate trends and projections. There's those vulnerability assessment syntheses, and they're linked at the bottom of the page under each of the habitat groups, along with the vulnerability adaptation summary. There's an adaptation strategies and actions table for download, and that's, again, an Excel spreadsheet. And then there's the adaptation workshop proceedings. And I also wanted to mention, I also wanted to say thank you to all of the many people. I think we must have had close to 100 or maybe more people who participated in workshops and sat on the stakeholder working group and provided input from tribal members from the Karuk and Yurok and many other tribal nations, peer reviewers. A lot of them I saw are I think hopefully on this webinar, but we had a lot of folks involved in this, which is I think one of the reasons that it was a great process, and one of the reasons I hope that it's really useful is because folks were involved in co-creating these products. So I just want to say thank you to all of them as well. So we have some time left for questions. Much time? Not a lot. So we can take a couple of questions. I know some folks may have to jump off. My email is here as well, so people are welcome to email me with questions after the fact. And I was thinking that maybe I could stop showing my screen and the other panelists could hop on. Carrie, can we see me?
I can see you, yes, but I can't see any of the other panelists right now.
Okay,
if they
great.
want to turn on their cameras.
Okay, so yeah, so if the other panelists could come on and we can maybe see if there are questions that folks want to ask. Let's see if I can find those.
We just have one at this point, but feel free to put others within the question tab.
Great. Yeah, so the question that we have, so folks should go ahead and ask other questions, enter them into the tab, or you can also raise your hand. But one question we got was that it's interesting to see most of the implementation plans focused on the resist part of RAD rather than the accept or direct parts. But with climate trajectories and funding time constraints, we are likely to mostly have to embrace accept or direct rather than resist. I'm curious about any insights on how to focus more on the A&D. Yeah, that's, I think, an ongoing issue that we see. People tend to emphasize resist. I think that's the way it's always been done, and it is what people tend to want to do. And one of the things that we try to do at EcoAdapt and we do in these workshops is gently but unstoppably urge people to start thinking outside of that box. And part of that has to include people understanding the changes that are going to happen, and also to sort of accept this idea that change isn't necessarily bad, or that you don't have to manage for the same conditions that have always been there. I don't know, Sarah or Jim or other folks, if there are things you want to add to that.
Yeah, I was going to say one place where we can incorporate a lot of these data products, including some of those great climate change projection data products like climate water deficit, is in our post-fire management. So I think that's one of the places that we really are thinking hard about the accept, redirect, direct part of that spectrum, because we can only manage so much of those post-fire landscapes. And so how do we pick the best places to manage? And it's definitely being informed by where can we have the most effect? What are our desired conditions? Where do we need to reevaluate our conditions? And I would say that's a big place for it. It's a little harder to do at the planning level. That's where we're naming our desired conditions. And so then, we're responsible for managing towards those desired conditions. But our new planning rule is meant to be more of a living document and more modifiable, so that as we see changes happening via our monitoring, we can go back in and change those desired conditions if they are now inappropriate. It's kind of a process.
Yeah, great. Jim, or Katie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what Sarah just mentioned is on the mark, and especially, understanding climatic water deficit is really critical and something that we pushed for as well. I would say that also thinking about connectivity is a way of getting to directing. That is to say, it's not that we're directing how species move, but we facilitate their capacity to move. And that may be very important for figuring out where things need to be. And one of the challenges, I think, for Northern California, Northwestern California, will be for fisheries and how water temperature changes, water quality will be really important, and understanding how we facilitate fisheries to move to the places they need to be in a changed climate. So it's not that we direct the future, but we direct the capacity of species to adapt more easily, and we may have some role there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we got another question. Are the priority area resources available at the URL? I'm not sure. This person who asked this, I don't know if you want to say exactly what you're thinking of. In terms of priority areas that we developed implementation plans for, those are all of the information about those are in the in the workshop proceedings. Everything that we have is pulled together, but if you're thinking of something different, please let me know. Are there any other questions that folks have? You can put them into the chat or raise your hand as well. Maybe Carrie, you can help me keep an eye out for raised hands.
Yeah, we have one more question that just came in. So it asks, how similar are these EcoAdapt adaptation workshops to the workshops offered by adaptation partners from the Pacific Northwest Research Station and the NIACS workshops applied through the Climate Change Response Framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of similarities. I mean, adaptation planning processes are pretty similar. For one of the workshops we give, we pulled together like 15 different adaptation planning process graphics that different places use, and they're all basically the same. So they're fairly similar. There are some differences. NIACS doesn't focus a lot on implementation, so they have these fantastic menus of adaptation strategies and actions that we draw from a lot, but they don't then focus on things like implementation. So one of the things that we do distinct from them is to sort of take it from the vulnerability all the way to the adaptation piece. But yeah, I don't know if Sarah or Jim, if you have any additional input on, why these agencies would choose sort of one over the other.
Yeah, I think we've used all of them in various places, so it really depends on like the capacity and the partners we have in place in any given landscape at the time that we embark. But they are resulting in pretty similar products and processes. We'll say we've combined the two. So, we've had some local project level workshops based on the NIACS workbook that took these EcoAdapt products as part of the information and resources and processes that went through that. So I think we're kind of like weaving them all together in more local place-based analyses as they come up. So I guess I just say like wherever the products are made, like just make use of them and get engaged. And that's the most important part of these processes in my mind, is engaging all the local experts who have so many years of experience and making sure that that information gets gets represented.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I would say too, this is the first major forest ecosystem focused project of this kind that the BLM has undertaken. But we have worked in arid ecosystems, deserts specifically, in developing the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan using climate modeling and adaptation criteria as well. And those actually don't have the long tradition of thinking, especially as nourished and nurtured by the US Forest Service. And so we were kind of on our own to develop a similar process or an analogous process for arid ecosystems as well. So we benefit very much from the work that the Forest Service and EcoAdapt have set before us as models for proceeding for management under climate change.
Yeah, and there's a lot of value to all of these approaches. We certainly work closely, and collaborate with those other folks. And yeah, like Sarah said, I think that it's whatever works for the people that want to do it. They're not necessarily one better than the other. All right, I don't think there are any other additional questions at this point, so we can wrap up. I am so glad that all of you could be here. The recording of this webinar is going to be sent to you all automatically after this webinar and to everyone who registered, but it will also be available on that product page along with the slides from the workshop today. So that will all be available for download later this week. And then you also are welcome to email me with questions if you have them after the fact. I will put my email in the chat right now. And thank you so much to all the presenters as well. You all did a great job giving that context, so I really appreciated having it all wrapped up together. All right.
Thank you, Laura, very much. I appreciate all the work that EcoAdapt has done. It's been truly important and impressive. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye now.